fails if we have some kind of computer problem. So always good to be here, and nice to see everyone. So I'm going to talk about the 17th Michigan Infantry, the Stonewall Regiment. I've been researching it since I started reenacting back in 1977 as a reenactor for Trainville, a soldier in the 17th. But in the early 80s, I found out that the reenactment group really didn't know much about the regiment they were trained. So a group of us got together to write a small booklet about it, and after that, I kept getting more and more stuff. So this is, since 1980, that's what, 40 years worth of research. So, and then we'll find out more about this picture. This is a picture of the 17th Michigan. We'll find out where it was taken and when it was taken later on. There's a kind of a blow up of it. And the one thing you can look, none of these men have their cartridge boxes on. For some reason, they have their muskets, they have their cap boxes, but they don't have their cartridge boxes. Just think about that. And so my project has two worksheets. One is for every day that the regiment existed over 3 years, there's a daily. It says where they were at reveille, where at tattoo, what did they do, action, and any personal activity. And anything I found in a letter, diary, a newspaper account, an official record, photograph, or maps is going to go in there. There was about 1,300 men in the regiment, including about 25 men from the 2nd Michigan that were temporarily transferred in near the end of the war. And so there was a big increase in replacements from mostly from Monroe County in 1864. That's what brings it up from, they left with just under 1,000 to up to 1,300. Also, there were 3 civilians. Austin George, who was from Ypsilanti, went to the normal school there, but he had lost his arm in a farm accident and couldn't enlist. But he went at the beginning of the war with Company E and was their company clerk for a while. And then there was Horace Phillips. His brother was an officer in the 17th. He was the sutler's assistant. Ralph Eli was the sutler. I don't know much about him, another thing I wanted to research. But anyway, I have a database that shows each person's name, where their hometown, what their occupation was, when they enlisted, and this goes on out another 10 feet. It says, were they killed, wounded, captured, deserted, discharged, died, and then also, do I have a picture of them? Do I have a picture of their grave? And if they were married, what was their wife's name? So it goes on, and it goes down for all 1,300. So the first, actually, the spring of '62, Lincoln called for more troops. So Michigan stepped forward to form a new regiment. And so what I did was I take the original document, transcribe it, and add it to this date. This would have been, they hadn't really started, they just were recruiting. But the recruiting posters were starting to come out. There is a story about one of the veterans that went to visit his brother, and they found a recruiting poster, different than this one, that now that I'm looking for it. They found it in the 1880s, they found it, and we don't know what happened to it. But this is one that did exist. So each day, there's going to be at least a list. Now sometimes there's more than this. For the Battle of South Mountain, their first battle, there's a dozen sheets because there's lots of information about the regiment at that time. Detroit Barracks. How many people know where that was? I guess not. You've all heard of Grant, being in let's see, when was he there? 1849. Yeah. Well, the Detroit Barracks, here's Gratiot Avenue. Everybody familiar with Gratiot Avenue? And then here's Jefferson down here. And then you can see, this is a modern map over here. So here's Ford Field, here's Gratiot, and then here's Jefferson. So the old Detroit Barracks, which was established in 1830, and by the time the Civil War started, they actually, out here by Elmwood Cemetery, was an area, a farm, that they called Camp Bacchus. That was named after Alfred, what's his name? Oh, Electus Bacchus. He was a recruiter at the time, but he had been in the Mexican War, and was in the colonel of the 29th U.S. and the 12th U.S. But he had died just in 1862, so they named this Camp Bacchus after. And some of the men in the 17th talk about going over to Elmwood Cemetery when they didn't have time to do this. So not all regiments formed at Fort Wayne in Detroit. Some of them formed here at the Detroit Barracks. And this whole area was pretty much open fields and stuff today. There was a rifle range, and there was, I think, 12 or 13 barracks buildings. So, and it wasn't all just in this area. And by the way, Grant's home was down here in 1849. And the only reason he became in charge of this, he was the last officer that was there before the whole, whatever regiment it was, got shifted to Sackett's Harbor, New York. And he was like, I think, a major at the time. So when they were recruiting during the summer, if you kind of go down US 12, you can go to Lenawee County near Adrian's, Company A, Washtenaw County around Manchester, Detroit, Saginaw Bay counties, Coldwater, Collin and Monroe County for Company C, Kalamazoo, Company D, Company E from Washtenaw County, and the majority of them were from the students of the normal school or teachers. Some of them were from Genesee County around Flint, and some from Muskegon. County F was Wayne County in Detroit, and Jackson around Grass Lake. Company G was almost entirely in Jackson County. Company H was around Quincy and Jackson County. Another Company I was more Kalamazoo soldiers, and Company K, Calhoun County, around Battle Creek, and Jackson County. So you found where US 12 can't go too far in finding the soldiers. And it's kind of a eye chart here, but some of the recruiters became officers. And some of the guys who were recruiting were also in the 1st Michigan 3-month unit. And when that unit came back after 3 months, they decided to come in the 17th. And a couple were Mexican War veterans. Company E was on their way to Detroit, and they stopped off at the Norris Block in Ypsilanti. Anybody familiar with that?
Yep, still there. Yeah.
Still there.
The restaurant's fabulous.
The restaurant.
There,
There's also,
Thompson.
we've been inside of there one time before that there was some wallpaper that I think had soldiers writing on it. And also, what was the automotive pioneer? Packer. Not Packer. It was, Tucker had his office.
Yeah, right.
Who's that?
There's an automotive museum across the street from that, and
Right.
that's,
So the men that were in the 17th were issued everything you could get, except they didn't have any gun blankets or shelter tents at the time they left Detroit. But they had dress hats, they had dress coats, they had the shoulder epaulets, and they also had 4-button coats. They had white gloves. They had everything they needed.
Pretty stuff.
And at their first battle, they had their white gloves tucked into their belts.
Don't fire until we see the whites of their gloves.
Now, before they left, that morning, they were gonna get on a boat to go to Cleveland. There was a reception for General Orlando B. Wilcox, Michigan native, who was in the colonel of the 1st Michigan 3-month unit. He was captured, and he was finally let loose a year after his capture So he was, they had a big reception for him in Detroit, and it was in the afternoon, and it was raining. So the guys in the 17th are getting ready to ship out with all that stuff that they had issued to them. And they were the honor guard for the Michigan Volunteer, for the Wilcox. So this is a photograph from the Bentley, not Bentley, the Detroit Library. And this is the arch that they had built to do that. So then, as soon as that ended, they were still, remember, they had no gum blankets, but their wet wool uniforms were all wet. They got on the May Queen, the boat for Cleveland. They left on the train when they got to Cleveland, they got on the train that took them to Pittsburgh, through Baltimore, and they were known for singing. Company E was a singing company, and so they were singing much to the chagrin of some of the Confederate sympathizers in Baltimore. And finally, they ended up in Washington, D.C. The morning of the fourth day of travel, outside where the Capitol is today, where they had some doubtful coffee and hard crackers. So then later on, they would travel back to Baltimore, and then along the B&O Railroad to Parkersburg and to Cincinnati, then down into Lebanon, Kentucky, out to Cairo, down to Vicksburg, Jackson, back up, down into the Knoxville campaign, back east, and then down into the Overland campaign, and ended up at Petersburg. So this was part of the 9th Corps, and it's Burnside's traveling geography class.
I was just gonna say.
So their first duty in Washington, D.C. was to guard the Navy Yard Bridge at Fort Baker. And so this was right when Robert E. Lee had started his march north into Maryland. So they were immediately put into the 9th Army Corps. So the 9th Army Corps, after leaving Washington, marched to Rockville, Hightstown, Damascus, Frederick, Middletown, and then on up to where their first encounter was at the Battle of Fox's Gap at South Mountain. So this is a map of a little town called Bolivar, which is like 4 houses. So as you're leaving on the National Pike, that's the National Pike, they turned left on this country road, and then up the old Shepherdstown, the Boone's, yeah, Sharpsburg Pike. And up here is where Fox's Gap was, where they had their first battle. This is a drawing from Battles and Leaders showing the field where they fought. And this field here is from the drawing from Battles and Leaders, and then here's a photograph from the 1920s. And here's the entrance to the field, and this is a gentleman who was our archivist from Massachusetts, and his summers were taken traveling to follow the Massachusetts regiments, and he just happened to follow the ones that were in the same division, same brigade division as the 17th. But Wise's Farm, you've all heard, I think you've heard about Wise's Farm up at South Mountain, where supposedly the Confederate dead from the Battle of Fox's Gap were buried. There's some debate about whether that was true or not. But the 17th came up this road, and right here is the entrance to the field. And the Confederates were up in here, and they charged across here. One company was on this side of the road, and they charged across that field. Fortunately, the pictures, like this picture here, I happened to meet a gentleman that was a historian from up there and a relic collector when I first started working on the regiment. And he shared his photographs, his collection that this guy from Massachusetts shared with his group of buddies that would go up there and travel. But right across here, their first action was right across from this house, the Kaufman House, which was right over there. The first Cook's battery was going into action to fight it, shoot at Confederate battery across the way, and they were driven back down this road, and the guys in the 17th had to jump out of the way. So, there's my grandson. There was a controversy about where we placed this marker. We placed it originally on the path of the, up here actually, on the old Appalachian Trail. And then it was moved. And so we temporarily moved it back, and now this is where it is actually, it's been located.
If you don't mind, we couldn't find it at first because it's covered now with foliage.
Oh,
And Vicki turned around and went, oh, it's across the road
Yeah.
over there. Yeah. You can
this is
barely
the
see it.
field actually that they
Yeah.
fought in. So the 17th came up through the field. The 79th New York was over on this side. The 45th Pennsylvania and the 46th New York were also up there. So, and I could do a whole talk just on the battle. Oh, no.
Next
Then-
year.
Yeah. Okay. Then 3 days later, they were at the Battle of Antietam. So they didn't get in the initial fight to go across the bridge. But between 1 and 2 o'clock after the U.S. troops had gone across the bridge, the 17th came up along the Sherrick Farm, which was here, and between the Sherrick Farm and the Otto Farm there's the Otto Farm and there's the Sherrick Farm. And so they were, that's where they moved out. So they were in Wilcox's division, and so they're going up towards where the cemetery is today. And this is about as far as they got. This is an early picture, and there's the same barn. That was one that I took, and this was an earlier one. So, and supposedly, there's one story that the Confederates had stolen a U.S. flag when they were at Harper's Ferry, and supposedly were trying to draw the troops in that direction with the U.S. flag. But that's also a story about exploding bullets at South Mountain. That could be Old West tale, I suppose.
Urban legend.
Yeah, urban legend. So after the Battle of Sharpsburg, they retired back across the river by the Werbach Park and spent their first big weekend. In October, they were in Pleasant Valley, which was between Boonesboro and Frederick. And they had a chance to do a review. This is from my page for that day. Edwin Bush from West Leroy wrote, this forenoon there was a division review. President Lincoln, Burnside, McClellan, and others were present. And I had the honor of seeing the president. He's a very plain-looking man indeed. Grove Seavey, who, his diary is, he was a very good diarist in that he had almost every day of the regiment existed. He had something, but it might say, I'm not feeling good. And the next day, I'm feeling better. And the next day, I've got bloody dysentery. But, and we'll see another picture of Grove Seavey. David Lane, who wrote a book about the 17th, my curiosity was gratified by seeing a live president, above all old age. He looks much better than the likeness we see of him, younger and not so long in length. And from the Detroit Advertiser, the president with McClellan on his right and the rough and ready Burnside at his left, followed the division and brigade commanders and their staffs as an escort, rode through the lines of each brigade, deafening cheers preceded and followed them. As they passed the 17th, McClellan informed the president it was the Stonewall Regiment, which we deemed with a smile of approval, took possession of the homeliest countenance your correspondent has met in his limited travels. But we felt, as we rode with his escort, they were in the presence of a great man of future history, a man whom the future biographer would compare with Jackson and Washington. But there was another man who saw Lincoln, and Charles Love, also in the 17th, A month later, he says, "Well, I was in the hospital in Washington with my chum Edgar Dickinson, and I asked for a pass to go downtown, which was given us. I noticed that the officer did not take the pass, so we kept clean and kept the pass clean and kept using them during his stay in Washington. One day, we thought we would walk over to the White House, not thinking we would be allowed to enter the grounds, but there being no one to stop us, we went to the front door, which was open, and the stairway leading up from the front door. We returned to the top of the stairs with no one to stop us. As we reached the top stairs, President Lincoln came out of the door on the right to cross the left on another room. He stopped, put his hand out, shook hands, and said, "Well, boys, how are you today?" Gave us a little talk and said goodbye. So, also, back in Michigan in October, 5 of brave boys from the 17th had been killed. And Stephen Palmer, the father of Alonzo, made a journey to Antietam. The remains were all brought back by train. So great was the throng that attended the burial. This is in Napoleon, Michigan.
Okay. I was just wondering.
A large detachment of soldiers acting as an honor guard together with mourners stretched from the depot in Napoleon to the cemetery. And this is the cenotaph that is in the cemetery that honors those soldiers from the 17th. Each casket was within its own hearse drawn by a white horse. It said that over 2,000 attended the funeral. So, and I don't know how many of you have ever been to Napoleon, but it's not that big of a town.
What cemetery is it?
It's the only one in Napoleon.
In Napoleon, it's the
Oh, that's
Napoleon
name of the
Cemetery.
town, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I probably
Grass
have it
Lake.
somewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
The 17th was the first of new regiments to leave the state under the president, and they rendezvoused at Detroit. Basically, I put this in here to show that they had crossed over the Potomac River on their travels after Antietam and after leaving Pleasant Valley on their way to Falmouth near Fredericksburg. But on the 30th of November, they had actually the 900 and some men that had left. 47 had died of wounds, 18 of disease, 201 discharged for disability. 2 missing in action, 34 discharged for no reason, that was written down, and 44 deserted.
Wow.
Now, at the end of the whole 3 years, over 90 men had deserted, including the Emerson brothers, who they sent a posse out of them and came back to Michigan and actually caught up with the Emerson brothers, and there was a shootout and one of them was killed. And one of the other brothers, though, is buried in the National Cemetery in Louisville. So the other 2 were the ones they found. And 2 officers had resigned by November. So at the end of November,
Bill,
Yeah.
this is within 2 months.
2 months.
Of them
Yeah.
arriving in
Right.
the theater.
right,
So when people who aren't familiar with the Civil War say, well, why were there only 350 men in
Right.
a 1,000-man regiment? When you see all the different
Such
reasons,
as a disability.
right.
it's incredible.
Wow.
And it gets worse afterwards. We'll talk about that. Now, we've heard about the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was in middle of December 1862. The 17th was better for it to have watched than to die. They were called up, but they didn't cross the river. They stayed on the west side of the river, and they've been watching the battle and the poor outcome for the Union soldiers. So basically, they were in the area. They were camped near George Washington's grandfather's farm. And they talk about being next to the George Washington's grandfather's farm, and it was a early winter from near the end of November until January, the end of January. It had snowed, and they were living in dugouts that they had. Then they get sent to the 9th Corps is gonna go west. So these are two photos from the Ninth Corps and Aquia Landing, Aquia Creek. We can't be sure that they're the 17th, but they're two original photos. And here's Fortress Monroe. They were docked, their ship was out here for a while too when they got on the boat because there was a bad snowstorm. They were out there for a couple of days. Fortress Monroe is the only place I haven't been that the 17th guys have it. So,
It's still there.
yeah. So, this was their itinerary for up to, we'll call it your trip to Jackson. So they, basically, they were in Falmouth, Newport News, Baltimore, Harpers Ferry, Parkersburg, along the Ohio River, along the Louisville, Bardstown, Lebanon, Columbia, Jamestown, Jeffersonville, Cairo, Mississippi River, Memphis, Ames Bluff, and Milldale, Tennessee. Colonel Withington, who was a captain of one of the first Michigan 3-month units, was the first colonel of the regiment. Constant Luce was the lieutenant colonel. But Withington's daughter, young daughter, had died, and his wife was ill, so he resigned. And Luce became colonel. This is in the beginning of 1863. This is a post-war picture of Luce, although it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
His tin whiskers there. That was part of his
Wow.
men's fashion. He was a Republican and he was a Democrat. And the officers and men were about split 50-50 in the regiment. And if you read the letters and diaries of the officers, there was some hard feelings about some promotions and stuff were based on politics. So,
Imagine that.
One thing don't change.
right. This is just a picture that I put out of what the 17th possibly could have looked like from January to June as they were in their travels, but they would have been arranged in a company street most of the time. And they did have a good time chasing Morgan's troops through Kentucky. That's where they were doing most of the time in Kentucky. Now, here is Vicksburg, and here's the Yazoo River, and Milldale, Kentucky is up, or Mississippi is up here. So they really weren't involved in the siege of Vicksburg. They got there about a week before, but some of the guys actually snuck down on the day of the surrender and walked down there. And Edwin Bush did send home a piece of the surrender flag. Now, I've seen it. I have copies of his letters. He was a very good letter writer till he was killed at Petersburg. But I have seen the picture of a surrender flag, a little piece of the surrender flag that he has. So, and then they went out to follow the Confederates out towards Jackson. And the 17th was up here with Park, and there was the insane asylum. The 17th was up there, and they passed through there skirmishing and got into the outside of where the penitentiary was. I think that's where they made it. So I don't know, I was talking to you about what you actually saw, but there isn't much on the battlefield to see.
Yeah,
Jackson.
nothing has really been preserved in Jackson.
But during this 2 weeks on this adventure, there was a dry spell. There was hardly any water anywhere to drink. The travel was pretty rough. The marching conditions were bad. Now, every day in my collection of daily things, there's at least one one account by some of the soldiers, or one of the soldiers, a newspaper account, or official record of all this. So, and here's a picture of the Battle of Jackson, much probably embellished.
Bill?
Yeah.
Were there soldier correspondents sending their views back to Michigan
Oh, yes,
newspapers? Those are very valuable.
Yeah, and I finally learned some of the names of there was one guy named Union,
Yeah.
who was a officer of the 17th from Company E, James Morgan. And I found out he was in the Union. So, their orders were to, next to go to Knoxville. The Confederates had sent Longstreet. And so they had gotten out here to Lennar Station along the Tennessee River. And the Confederates were coming up this way. And Burnside decided he better retreat to Knoxville. So the 17th Michigan was the last regiment between them and the Confederates going down the road. And at that time, you're talking, there was only 300 men in the regiment at that time that could fire rifles. So, and our friend Gary Pritchard, was the cook of our 17th Reenactment group. There is a story about the cook going down the road with his pots and pans and stuff falling out of his backpack. They also had to travel across the Cumberland Gap, so that was an interesting experience. One of the soldiers was a nurse at the time. I mean, they didn't run into many female nurses. They were taking care of themselves. But there was, going through Cumberland Gap, one of the carriages tipped over that had some soldiers in it. So part of the fighting on the way to Knoxville was this crossing the Little Turkey Creek. And on their way back, they're headed towards along the Kingston Road to I'm having a senior moment here, the town next to the road. So the 17th actually fought their way back, all the way back across up and then up to today it's called Farragut. But here is a Turkey Creek near Virtue, Tennessee. And this is the creek right underneath the road here. And the 17th had come in this direction. There was a mill down there. We've been to it. It's fallen apart by now. But some of the men in the 17th had hidden there. But once Luce was in charge, his second officer was Lauren Comstock, and the third officer was Frederick Swift. As they were crossing here, Swift said, "Oh, we've gone far enough." So he stood there with the two flag bearers, the state flag and the federal flag, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his stand at that position.
And were they trying to retreat to the defenses of Knoxville?
Yeah, well, first, that was the idea.
Okay.
Probably not. So Frederick Swift, acting major and commanding the regiment at the time, because both the other two officers weren't with the regiment at the time. He was in charge. He and Color Sergeant Joseph Randall were both awarded the Medal of Honor. The state color bearer, Charles Thompson, should have been awarded the medal as well. But in 1864, Thompson put up a defense of the flag at Spotsylvania, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor there. So, on Campbell Station, this is what Campbell Station would have looked like. Today it's called Farragut, Tennessee. If you haven't ever been to that place, that's an excellent place to go.
Farragut as in the Admiral?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's Admiral Farragut's hometown.
Okay.
That's where he's born. And he was born at Campbell Station. So they were amongst the 9th Corps there. So it's a good trip to go to, and we can trace the movement of the men across the field. So here's 3 pictures of Frederick Swift. He was probably the most dynamic of the commanding officers. Near the end of the war, he was in charge of the regiment. But he was also captured at Spotsylvania and made an escape, though.
Was Luce perhaps lacking in
No,
combat fortitude? Or
I'm not sure what but he gets court-martialed near the end of the war, but that was for financial reasons.
yeah, but he's buried in Monroe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same Luce I was
Yeah.
thinking.
Oh, yeah. Also at Campbell Station, F.M. Howe of the 20th Michigan, which was regated with the 17th, and B.W. Bruce from Adrian, they both lost their legs there. So they wrote this poem about the soldiers we met on having his, actually, the leg and foot blown off by tried to stop the cannonball from rolling.
No.
Not a good idea.
Oh, but
Everything looks.
he was, when, at the picture I showed of, the crossroads at Virtue, he was taken prisoner and held by the Confederates for a while. And the sons of the lady that owned the house buried his foot out there. So unlike Jackson's foot in Virginia, this guy's foot is still out in the farm somewhere.
Yeah.
But he was treated well, and he survived. And he came back in the 1880s, and they got money and took it back to the family. The lady, the mother had died, but the children were still living there. They were adult children by then. And they got money from the U.S. government.
And which one did this? Bruce?
Bruce, yeah.
Okay.
The other, and here's at Knoxville, the attack at Knoxville, where the Confederates, after the siege of Knoxville, had attacked and the 17th was in the trenches. Here, Luce was back with the regiment. Also, a thing I learned too, that there was a lot of furloughs given. All during this period, men were going back and forth to recruit, especially officers and NCOs. Luce had gone back, that's why he wasn't there. And Loren Comstock, he was in the trenches, and he was just leaving his tent on the edge of the trenches and was shot by a sharpshooter. And just after this.
Is that one of the readouts rebuilt by Orlando Poe? 'Cause I know he.
Oh, yeah, Poe was involved in all the trenches, all the building the trenches. And there's a picture of Loren Comstock. He's buried in the cemetery in Ann Arbor. Now, Captain Todd, his job on January 1st was to get Comstock's body, which had been sitting in a cold storage warehouse in Knoxville, get it back here to get it back to the train, go from Knoxville up here to Strawberry Plain. And his walk on Sunday morning was to walk from Knoxville, or where they were in camp, and get him on the train. Well, the train, by the time he got there, the train had been gone, so he had to leave the body, embalmed body in the train station, but this was in the middle of January. And he got on the train the next day. But, and then Todd, he was involved at Petersburg on the defenses, helping. He had to go into City Point, get tools and equipment. And he was later discharged near the end of the war. He got a bullet wound to the top of his head. But his diary was also very helpful.
Excuse me, Bill, where is Comstock buried? Which cemetery, at Forest Hill?
Oh,
In Ann Arbor?
for Comstock?
Yeah,
I have to get back with you.
okay,
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
find it very quick.
So,
Cemeteries.
now the 17th does come back east, and they go to near Baltimore, Camp Parole, and they're reorganized. And that's where the 200 recruits, most of them from Monroe County, come into play. And the Overland Campaign, we know, goes from the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Topopotomy Creek, Cold Harbor, and finally ends up at Petersburg. But the 17th, who, and I think you might have been here when I brought the flag in, when the Nates brothers, that they were involved in the first fighting at the Wilderness. But at Spotsylvania, the 17th was just outside of the Mule Shoe. And so here's the 17th Michigan. They're on the edge of the Union line. The Confederates had come around and swung up 2 whole brigades in behind the 17th. And it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It had been raining. It was muggy. And the North Carolina unit plunged right into the middle of the 17th. Constant Luce said that all he remembers, he's knocked over by a soldier, then hit by a cannonball. So he's laying on the ground and the Confederates go over him. Swift is captured at this battle, but he escapes and gets back to the ranks. So the 17th lost their flag here. So at this time, because they called Wilcox's pets, they became engineers, and there was only about 50 guys left that actually, for the muster roll that after the battle of Maine. The rest were in hospitals, or the ones that were captured. There was over 90 of them captured. Probably here at this battle, like 70 of them were POWs, and were ended up at Andersonville, where 50 some of the men died. So the family was broken, as Edwin Bush said in his diary. So, although they were in line as the days went on for this overland campaign, more of the men came into line, and they got jobs. It's interesting that a lot of them were aides at other officers' messes and on detached duty. Here is Spotsylvania Courthouse. Frederick Swift remembers seeing Lee here as he was captured, and when he got up here, he could see Lee up here with. Didn't meet him, but did see him.
And, sorry, where's the flag? Do you know if that flag's still?
That's the one that's in Washington D.C. It was returned. I did go out to Connecticut to Don Troni's studio, and he has the effects of one of the men, Sergeant Smith of Company A, who ended up being the Sergeant Major. And that he has one of those stars that's missing from this flag, and some pieces that were souvenired over here. This is not that, along the edge, where it's missing. So that's the flag that was captured.
Wow. And
But
that's
it was returned.
in DC.
Yeah. And this is a good place to bring up Andersonville, but also earlier in the war, some of the prisoners, the 17th guys, were at the Richmond prison in Belle Isle, Andersonville or Camp Sumter, the Florence Stockade, Camp Oglethorpe, Macomb, Castle Pinckney. That's where Swift ended up. That was where they threatened to kill the U.S. officers. They kept. And Morgan Dowling, he wrote a book where he escaped from Andersonville, Florence, and probably another 2 or 3 prisons he claims. He was in the 17th. Dallas Phillips and Benjamin Safford did escape. They were on a train headed towards Andersonville, and they somehow opened a hole in the bottom of the train car and got out, and they walked all the way back from across the Appalachians to West Virginia, which was a state by then. And then Swift, he made his escape. And I happened to be at Andersonville doing a living history with Gary Pritchard and another guy from the 17th whose great-grandfather survived Andersonville. Here is John Messerall. He was the hospital steward of the 17th. These are 9th Corps hospital stewards. These are probably, could be officers, 1 or 2 from the 17th, while the 2 servants are doing a cockfight. You can't see it, but my thing isn't working right now, but you can see the roosters there. And then over at Petersburg, since they were the pet of Wilcox, the 17th camp was over here. And this was the lines of Petersburg, but and there's even photographs of the camp. Doesn't show any of the men, but there's photographs. And then this was a pass that was saved from the 17th Regiment's headquarters at the. Well, I mean, the one thing that the 17th did do at Petersburg, besides being in trenches, was at Fort Stedman, a Confederate attack near the end of the war. The 17th rallied and was involved in helping to stop the Confederates from attacking Fort Stedman. I mentioned Edwin Bush. Edwin Bush was from West Leroy, and he was killed at Petersburg by a sharpshooter. And he was sitting at next to a tree and talking about what they did at Milldale, Mississippi. And he's talking about it, and he gets shot in the head. Another soldier said, yeah, my friend Edwin was shot, and the bullet made a thwack sound. And also, I was able to get the doctor's report for Edwin Bush, and he had lived a little while, but died that afternoon. And then we have, and Edwin Bush also had the telegram that was sent to his parents, saying, or sent to his parents by his sister, saying that Edwin's body is on its way back. Come quick, it won't last long. So. And I've been to almost the spot where Edwin was talking by the tree. So that brings us to the end of the war, the Grand Review. And also the men were anxious to get their discharges. And this is just one discharge that we have. In fact, that's at the Chelsea Library there. That's Chapman's discharge paper. Museum.
Thank you. Great, Steve.
And how many were left then that could do the Grand Review?
Oh, at the Grand Review, there might have been close to 400. So here's Christian Rath. He's from Jackson, and Richard Watts from Adrian. Here they are in the picture. They were on extended duty as provost marshal. A lot of times the 17th was also on the provost guard, rounding up soldiers. So they happened to be at the arsenal where the Lincoln assassination conspirators were being hung. Christian Rath, sometimes people think that the guy in the white coat was Christian Rath, but he had his uniform on. That's not Christian Rath. He's up in the crowd there somewhere. So he's up on the he actually supervised the building of the scaffold. And he talked to Powell. And Powell says, make sure you put that noose around my neck pretty tight there, Captain. And he said, I will. And he also was very anxious that Mrs. Surratt would not be hung. He held out hope that to the last minute that she would be saved by a legal procedure. But and then when she was hung, he was in charge of taking the bodies down, and was sick to his stomach when he had to take the hood off and saw that her neck was cut. I talked to his great niece who lived with him in the 1920s, and she was a young girl. She remembers that he became a Christian Scientist because they don't preach about hell. And he also had nightmares about Mrs. Surratt's daughter coming to him. So,
You know, I understand that Rath was promoted after the execution, and the account that I read was that in good part because he had only been given, I think, 2 days to put these gallows together, and so it was a round-the-clock effort to get everything done, and to make sure that everything went off smoothly.
Yep. And he was the one that once General Hancock said it's going to be done, he gave the clap, and then the guys down below kicked the supports up.
That is
He
amazing.
would ride his horse in the parades at Jackson. There's the coffins that were outside the scaffold. Now, we happened to run, and I did transcribe letters of another man who was in charge of the U.S. Veteran Volunteers, the other men out there that were on duty that day. And they asked him, how did the prisoners go up the scaffold? Well, he said, everybody but Powell had to be helped up the stairs. But Powell went up with a hop, skip, and a jump. And in his diary that day, he says, I was glad to see them swing off into eternity. And then he went to the theater that night.
Not the forest, though.
Yeah. A different one. Now, supposedly even the supposedly brought back pieces of the ropes. And his son, who owned a jewelry store in Jackson, supposedly had them in there, but I haven't been able to find them. But there was another doctor who was involved with the Kennedy assassination, who I think had found someone purchased at least one piece of the rope. Now, the 17th did come back to Michigan in June 1865. There was 395 officers and men that traveled back. And they got off the boat dock here at the Detroit Boat Company. And the picture we saw in the front was actually taken there, but we didn't know that when that picture was first found by my friend Dale Neeson and I. If you look at the, reach over here, next to the soldier, there's a name in the thing. And it happens to be the Gagarin Society, the Gagarin Gallery of Randall. So, and when we saw this picture, when we thought, well, gee, it was taken at Grass Lake because there was a soldiers' reunion in August of 1865 at Grass Lake. And there was 50 men from Grass Lake that had been in the regiment, including several officers. And Dale and I went out there and we looked for a place and we thought we might have found it, but it wasn't. Then we found where it said Randall, and well, Randall could have got on the train in Detroit and gone to Grass Lake because there was over 1,000 soldiers and 5,000 people in the little town of Grass Lake for a chicken cookout. But we realized later, and we'll get into that this picture was taken at the Detroit barracks, Camp Bacchus. Notice the bell tents, or the unusual tents, and there's only about 168 men in this picture. And like I said, none of them have their cartridge box belts. We think that the cartridges were not necessary since they were being discharged. And it took more than one day for them to be discharged. Some of the men took off right away. So this is probably a couple days into the discharge. And we can identify the men in the picture because we have this picture that was supposedly also taken at Grass Lake of the officers. And we were able to identify who all these officers were. And so we've gone through a whole process of identifying where they are in the picture, and you can contact whatever the regiment was aligned, the double companies formed in mass on the center. And then if you look over here, looks like a rock, but actually it's a parasol. And you can see the lady behind the soldier. She's got the parasol up like that. So we don't know who she was there with. There was a young African-American woman that came back with the regiment that was probably a teenager that had been a servant with one of the officers in the regiment. But keep in mind the officer's picture, because there's another view of the officers, but there's 4 more officers over here. And this was on eBay, so I didn't get a good detailed picture of it. But we did, later somebody shared some surreptitiously a version of it. So we know that this guy, who was Horace Gallup, who was a Baptist preacher and the chaplain, there was three chaplains, one guy only lasted a month, and Horace Gallup only lasted a year. But because he was from Grass Lake, the Michigan State Archives said, oh, this picture was taken in Grass Lake. So it's still that way, I think, in the archives. But when you look over here at this picture of the 24th Michigan, one of the companies, you can see that this barn and that tree and this tree line, if you really hear it, were the same. And the 24th Michigan was 2 weeks later at Camp Bacchus. And it was used, this picture was used in Mr. Petrie, who was a musician in the 24th, to sell his musical instruments that he made. And also then when you look at this picture, this guy here, it says Randall. So now we know that those pictures were taken at the same time.
So in Detroit, not Grass Lake.
on Grass Lake.
Right.
So here, yeah, here's the, see this tree?
Yep.
There's that tree. And then you can see the barn down at the end, that's the barn, and if you travel the trees. get that. So we know that it was taken at the same time. We were just wondering, there were a few other regiments that came through, and these, we haven't found any more Randall photos from that. Also, you've all heard of the Sultana, that was just
Yeah.
not too long ago. Sergeant Aaron B. Waterby was one of the 3 Michigan men that were perished on the Sultana. Now, he wrote a letter to his wife when he got on the Sultana in Memphis, saying, I'm headed up the river, or Vicksburg. He got on the Sultana at Vicksburg, and he sent a letter to his wife saying, I'm on my way home. He didn't make it, and we never know whether the letter actually got to his wife. His granddaughter, who lives in Dexter, brought the picture to me and the letter, because she was able to buy it on eBay. And there's no evidence that it actually got home, but it was a letter that he wrote saying that I'm on my way. And there was two other, T.J. Peckham and R.F. Doan and J.C. Briggs that were on there, and one man, Emery Smith, survived the sinking.
Where was Waterbury coming from?
He was
a
from
prisoner.
Andersonville.
Here, Andersonville, that's what I thought.
So, and then remember I talked about Mr. Seavey? He was the guy that was always sick.
Oh.
He was from Ypsilanti, and his granddaughter has shared his letters with us. So I've been in touch with granddaughters, grandsons, great-grandsons, granddaughters, and that, with a lot of these soldiers. And she shared a picture of these Ypsilanti. I don't know who the rest of them are, I suppose we could find out that. Erwin Shepard from Chelsea, Michigan, was involved in a party of men who were burning a house in Knoxville that the Confederate sharpshooters were using to pick off the men in the trenches, like Lauren Comstock. And so he was awarded the Medal of Honor, along with another man in that party, for going out there and helping to burn that house. His great-grandson shared his letters. Now they're at the Bentley Library. And Edwin Bush's letters are another source. Frederick Swift, he's had a sort of diary, Todd's diary. So there's a lot of first-person accounts. Moses Amphlett had this GAR ceramic canteen made. I don't remember the soldier. This is John P. Smith. That's the guy that was he moved to Connecticut after the Civil War, and that's where Don Troni was in Don Troni's collection. I don't remember where that came from. And the 2 ribbons that I have in my collection. Now they would have, and then we've seen them, when I brought the flag from the Mapes brothers, there's the Mapes brothers.
And I can't remember where you said the flag was, the brothers brought that
Oh,
back.
they were at Wilderness.
Yeah.
There's a little piece that was cut off was down here where they found the evidence of organic material. And William Gilby was a musician. We're not sure that's actually his drums, but they're at the Monroe County Historical Society. I don't know. You know any more about that?
Pardon?
The drums that are at the Monroe County Historical Society.
No.
I'm
I'm
not
sure
sure.
JJ and the current people do,
Yeah.
or Matt, certainly.
Yeah. So I think that Gilby is either this guy over here or this guy over here, I'm not sure. So. Well, one of the things too, before I ended up here, I think I went over that. Now let's talk about the veterans. In 1943, there was 5 veterans left. And Martin Luke was in the 17th Michigan. Now, the 17th had been having reunions from 1867 until 1929. Luke did not attend very many of the reunions. And at 100 years old, in 1943, he said, I plan to live to be 150, and I'm gonna go to the reunion 2 years later. But he died before he made that one, so he was the last 17th Michigan veteran to die. There was 2 other men that were alive in 1934, that they were the last 2 to attend the reunions. And I thought, and they died in 1936, but then I found that Luke was the last one. Now, the 17th had the monument at Spotsylvania, and also this one at Virtue. It's also in an area where a Tennessee soldier from the Vietnam was awarded the Medal of Honor. It's from Virtue, Tennessee. The Medal of Honor, there was so we had Frederick Albert, James Christensen got his Medal of Honor when he was with Custer, although he had been with the 17th at the beginning of the war. Irwin Shepard was from Chelsea. McFall, Andrew Kelly. William Withington got his because when Wilcox was captured with the 1st Michigan in 3 months, Withington stayed with him. Frederick Swift and Joseph Randall. And the other guy was McFall got his at Spotsylvania. Irwin Shepard at Knoxville. Charles Thompson. There we go. Oh, John Falconer was at Fort Saunders. Let me see. And this is the National Cemetery in Knoxville and the Antietam Cemetery. And then part of my goal is to find everybody's grave. So this is just a sample of the ones that I have, and to visit them all. And again, here was the men. You can see a very hard-looking crew. And I think I skipped over one of the slides that showed, I looked at all the ages of the men. There was 3 soldiers under 15. They were musicians that were recruited at the beginning. If you were 12 and you could play a musical instrument, a drum or a pipe, you could be accepted. But they were all discharged by the end of 1862. The U.S. government said, hey, you're too young to do this. One, age 16, was a musician, and there were 15 young men who were 17. The mode, or the most number of men at a certain age, were 232 that were age 18. So that was the most number there. The average age was 24. The midpoint was 31, and the oldest guy was 51. He was one of the surgeons. So in 1862, there was roughly 1,005 men by the end of 1862 that were on the rolls. 65 recruits in 1863, 205 in 1864, and 23 in 1865. For a total of about 1,300.
Bill, any idea on those 200 and some in 64, whether those were drafted or volunteers?
Most of them were volunteers.
Okay.
Most of them were. There was just a few. One of the last things that was done, if you've ever been to Jackson, you can see the cemetery on West Washington. This was probably financed mostly by William Withington, who, after the war, became a soldier's friend. He and his wife were host and hostess of many of the reunion dinners. They would have campfires, they would have parades, and all kinds of things. So I kind of look at this as a monument to the 17th, but it's to the Michigan Civil War soldiers in general. Now, the next question is, what are we gonna do with all this? Well, I don't know. There's 8 books online, or online, that are over 1,500 pages. There's an organizational chart that shows how the Army was organized for the 17th participation. An organization chart of the 17th showing every officer and NCO for every company for the whole length of the 3 years. There's a whole book of miscellaneous information, which is obituaries for all the soldiers. There's one database with the 1,300 soldiers, 10 databases with the gravesite photos, and another 12 with their photos, or another database of 12. And then the other project, whenever I have time, is a monthly return listing every man in the regiment for every month that they were there, with either present or absent or some code showing where they were at. So if some ancestor some descendant wanted to know where their person they're looking for was, you could find where it was, but I don't know if that'll go. So I have to talk to the people at the Bentley Library.
Well, or else the State Museum, I don't know what kind of archives they keep.
But I'd like to make it accessible online.
Yeah,
Is it online now? or-
No, it's on my computer, but
Oh, I see. Well,
if anybody wants a copy of the database, they can, although there is a database online that is based on the Michigan Adjutant General's report
Right.
from
Sure
1901.
your poor computer doesn't crash.
Well, yeah,
His
got a lot of
backups, his backups.
I bet.
you back up the backup, yeah.
Yeah,
Magnificent talk, will you entertain questions?
yes.